I could weep with joy.
Well, what are we here today? About 75 degrees and clear blue skies? I don't know.
Oh, that's classic.
It's pretty nice, I have to say.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's, but we pay hard in the July and August.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the best thing about Chicago is that you can go to the beach. It's the lake.
Yeah,
and
I've
the lake
seen
is blue.
images. Yeah, I've seen some images that are pretty impressive. Now, is it pretty iced over right now? It must be.
It was iced over, and then there was like a giant cleave in the ice that they caught on camera, and the tweet about it went viral, and it's really incredible. I mean, when I heard that the lake was frozen over, and I mean, Lake Michigan is impossibly huge. Like, it stretches out all the way into the horizon as far as the eye can see, like the ocean. And so the idea of something like of that scale being frozen over was just a little too tempting to pass up. So I managed to like ride my gravel bike down there to see, and it's like Siberia. I mean, like
Amazing.
it's like I mean, the images are indelible and sublime, and I've never seen anything like it in my life, being from the South myself.
Mhm.
So
where are you from?
Yeah, I'm from North Carolina. This doesn't happen there.
Ah, yeah.
But
Didn't know. What part of North Carolina?
sort of like an hour south of Raleigh. So like Pinehurst, I guess, is the most notable place nearby, which is where they had the U.S. Open a few times. And apparently it's home to like the Frank Lloyd Wright of golf architecture. Not that I know. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about how golf courses work, but that's kind of cool.
That's another blog.
Yeah, no, yeah. I bet there would be so many good McMansion Hell spinoff blogs. I personally want to see one about car design. I feel like that would be such a great one.
Well,
Yeah.
You have a putting green in one of these houses. There's an indoor putting green.
Oh yeah, there are.
Amazing.
Golf is such a central part to McMansions, which is so funny to me. I mean, it's just terrible land use all the way around, if you ask me. I mean,
yeah.
I kind of grew up around it, but like, you know, I was like in like golf areas, but like my parents like didn't have like that much money, so like playing golf was just like kind of, you know, not something you do.
Well, we're having, you know, the repercussions of the Tiger Woods effect is that, you know, some golf courses are just closing. And we've had at least one project in our research center was to study how to use a dead golf course.
Oh yeah, that's a great.
So that's kind of a thing now. Yeah.
I read somewhere that in California they're passing legislature that like details like how golf courses could be turned into places for affordable housing development, like if they don't reach like certain like economic goals or whatever. Unsure if this is private or public golf courses. We have quite a few public golf courses in Chicago. If you ride on the Lakefront Trail, at the southern terminus is a golf course, and near the northern terminus is also a golf course. And they're public golf courses, so I mean it's better than like private ones. But it's kind of funny that like even in a city of this scale, there's golf. There's space for golf.
Yeah, you wouldn't think, right?
Chicago is kind of a strange city that way. Like the scale of it is so huge. Like it just sprawls forever. It feels like.
Yeah.
And so you can have like sort of fascinating things in there, but yeah, no, the Tiger Woods effect. Yeah, it's the same thing that it's like something similar happened in cycling after, you know, the whole Lance Armstrong thing. So
right.
Yeah. Though there aren't that many velodromes in the world in the US, so it wasn't as much of a land use problem, but there was a huge drop off in interest in the sport. And like an associated lack of funding that has had serious ramifications for the development of the sport. So which is why you see so few American cyclists making names. So yeah, funny how that one guy has so much power over a sport. You know, it's American sports are like that. It's so crazy. Like, one wonders what's going to happen when Tom Brady retires.
Well, Tampa Bay doesn't want him to retire for one more year anyway.
No, I mean, he and for good reason.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I turned the Super Bowl off because that was a done deal.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think we
Sports
can get
talk
rolling.
over.
Sports talk over. Tune in again next Thursday.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's lecture. I'm going to introduce Kate Wagner in just a minute, but let me update you on some things going on around the school. March 5th, we have a Career Expo, and that is at 9 a.m. So for those of you seeking gainful employment after you've completed your studies or over the summer, you can make arrangements to interview with any number of offices. We'll be sending out more information on that in the next day or so, but it's next Friday, March 5th, and it's 9 a.m. There'll be a meeting for all the students interested and the faculty, and not the faculty, but the firms at 9 o'clock, and then we'll break into separate teams rooms after that. But we will send out links for all the different firms as well as their website so you can take a look at their work. And certainly if anyone is tuning in who is with an office looking for student interns come May, drop a note to Audrey Scanlon. Audrey is going to put, and probably has already put, but we'll put her email in the chat, and she is organizing that right now. Coming up on March 11th, Carlos Molnar and Gerald McCants will be giving the lecture together. They're both alumni from the school. They have practices here in town, and they've frequently collaborated as separate practices going in on work together, sharing employees and so on, sharing office space. And they're going to talk a little bit about their collaboration and their own experiences as architects and talk a little bit about their work. They've also been involved with the school in both the teaching and a critic capacity for years. So it's great to have Carlos and Gerald involved. Also on March 11th, our presentation with Carlos and Gerald is at 3 p.m., but at 6 p.m. through the Tampa Bay AIA, Mario Gooden from Columbia University is going to be talking. Mario is a friend from way back. I taught with him at UF years ago, and he has also lectured here and taught here, but it's been several years. He has a proposal for the Woodson Museum of African American History in the St. Pete area that he's going to talk about. Mario is a professor of professional practice at Columbia University in New York, and again, a partner in Huff and Gooden Architects based in Clemson, based in Charleston, South Carolina, and New York City. And then on March 18th, Alex Anmahayan from Anmahayan and Winton Architects in Boston is going to be talking. Alex has lectured here in the past, but it's been several years. He's a dear friend. We went through school together, and he has a terrific practice in Boston. And current work includes, in addition to one of the important buildings in the MIT campus, he's also recently completed a tower in Turkey, and he's perhaps best known to you for the rowing house in Boston that he completed several years ago that received a national AIA award and many other awards. We also visited his office in the fall of 19 in a studio that Professor Gunderson and I team taught. So some of you had occasion to listen to Alex talk about his work then. So those are the upcoming events and some things worth tuning in for. So a big welcome to today's speaker. Sorry, my phone's going off. I first saw Kate Wagner's website, McMansion Hell, about a year or so ago, a little over a year ago, and I thought it was hilarious, and it is. But it also is a way to offer cultural criticism, and that's really what Kate talks about. So we got in touch last fall, and she's able to join us today. So a big welcome to Kate. Kate has a very interesting background in music and acoustics. She finished a degree in acoustics at Johns Hopkins recently, and relocated from DC to Chicago, from where she joins us today. She's currently the architecture critic at the New Republic and the creator of McMansion Hell, as mentioned, a blog which engages with cultural criticism through architectural humor. She's been widely published and is featured as a columnist in publications such as Curbed and The Baffler, in itself a really interesting publication. Her work on architecture can also be found in The Atlantic, CityLab, and the Architecture Review, among others. So we had a really interesting all too brief conversation yesterday. And here we've been talking about cycling and other sports. So I think we're going to go back to architecture and criticism for a little while.
Yeah.
So let me hand this over to you, Kate. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. And yeah, that's exciting about Mario Gooden. His book, Dark Space, is really fantastic. If you haven't read that, really great compliment to the new book out by Mabel Wilson about modern architecture and race. So personal recommendation. And so anyway, so this, like, Robert and I were talking about how one time Michael Sorkin came to speak and said, this is a lecture, and so I don't have any slides. And I'm in the same camp as that, to paraphrase. And so I don't have any slides. And so I'm going to give a lecture, old school style. Kind of funny to have pictures of things when you're talking about writing, which is very much not a pictorial sport. So if you ask me personally, in 2016, when I was an unair-conditioned graduate student living in the top floor of an old factory with 5 other people, all of whom were men, where I thought I would be 4 or 5 years after that, I would have probably said something like, hopefully not in poverty. And if you said I'd be giving lectures at architecture schools around the country, I would have laughed at you. If you said, hey, Kate, you're going to be an architecture critic, I would have just stared blankly, because an architecture critic is one of those things people don't really become anymore. I quit my job as an intern at a loudspeaker company and began writing full-time, later building my career over the course of the last 4 or 5 years by freelancing at bigger and bigger publications. But when I started McMansion Hell, I was in between an undergrad in music composition and a graduate degree in audio science. I thought I was going to work a desk job, like looking at reverberations time spreadsheets for a living, if I was lucky. I started the blog as a joke between me, an ex-boyfriend, and a mutual friend, and then it went viral. And people think that going viral is something you can cultivate, like something you can manifest in the world with the right combination of keystrokes or the careful planning of content, #content. It's not. It's like mostly an accident. Going viral is something that happens to you. An insurance company would classify it as an act of God. I decided way back when to use my knowledge of architecture to discuss why McMansions are terrible attempts at traditionalist aesthetics. I had 7 followers at the time, and as such, this was essentially posting into the void on Tumblr, the site the blog is hosted on. And I woke up the next day to find that the post had exploded by means I am still unsure of to this day, garnering thousands of likes and then tens of thousands of likes. And then suddenly people knew who I was and wanted my opinion on things. It's a very startling shift. If any of you happen to go viral, I recommend deleting social media posts from when you were in high school, changing your passwords, and stepping away from the computer for a few hours, if not days. Going from being unknown to known is always a possibility on the internet, and being known when one is used to being unknown with such suddenness is deeply unsettling, I will be honest. It takes quite a bit of time to get used to, and while exciting, I struggled with it. I had to figure out who it was I wanted to be on the internet, like what kind of personality I should have cultivated, how to be, quote, professional when my project was so inherently irreverent. In the end, after a few years, I decided to simply be myself, for better or for worse. But the downside to this is that people feel entitled to you. Open yourself to the world, and the world will demand more. I say these things because the internet has radically changed the landscape of who is or can be considered an authority, who is given legitimacy. In some ways, this can be seen as a shift towards greater opportunities to be heard, unstifled by the heady days of climbing one's way up within various institutions. Such can be said about my personal journey. However, virality has a dark side too, especially in writing. I think often of a recent article in the Columbia Journalism Review about the liberal Trump-era political commentator Seth Abramson, who was/is well known for his sprawling, heavily conspiratorial threads on Twitter, which he has himself dubbed, quote, meta-journalism. Abramson, a public defender, come poet, come journalist, who started out his career writing reviews of MFA programs during the blogging era, went viral in 2017 for a tweet criticizing Kellyanne Conway and quickly posted his way into being a columnist at Newsweek and a frequent guest on cable news. Yet, as the article's author Liz Lenz writes, Abramson's metajournalism may not actually be journalism. It's just him sitting at home tweeting out stories he stacked together like a house of cards without vetting them for accuracy. The picture she paints is a dark one, of a neurotic man unable to reconcile the reverence, or rather lack of scrutiny, one gets from self publishing and internet clout with the fact checked institutional world of capital J journalism. She succinctly describes the situation as thus: in some ways, virality has enabled marginalized voices to be heard, but an ecosystem ruled by likes and retweets is one in which nothing really has to be true. Everything is entirely possible, and notoriety confers legitimacy. By 2016, when I started the blog, I had been reading and writing about architecture for around 8 or 9 years. I spent my high school years writing poems and music about architecture and lurking in the skyscraper city forums on brutalism while listening to Steve Reich. I wanted to be an architect when I was in high school, but was discouraged by my guidance counselor because I had a B- in Algebra 2, and I was a decent enough classical musician to go to school for it, and so that's what I did. This is why you don't let 18-year-olds make decisions about their lives. I'm an architecture critic who did not go to architecture school, probably the only one alive right now. Though my graduate studies in architectural acoustics did involve learning some of the technical aspects of architecture, such as CAD drawing and model making, and gave me an opportunity to take classes in the fine arts and classics, such as in drawing and in Roman architecture specifically. All this is to say that architecturally speaking, I'm self-taught, and I feel that this is very important to point out because it's something that I used to be ashamed of, but have now sort of embraced. I have a deep love for the vernacular, and what is the vernacular if not the lapsing built efforts of the self-taught? This is part of the reason why, for me, going viral and becoming notable did not give me a sense of legitimacy. Over the course of the last 5 years, I freelanced on the side, writing for a number of publications. Some of them were smaller, like the 99% Invisible blog and Atlas Obscura. And then in places like Curbed, which were more notable but still confined to certain parts of the internet pertaining to architecture, urbanism, and design. When I was invited to write about sound in the city for The Atlantic in 2018, that's when I realized that I had made it into the world of so-called serious writers. And after that, I began writing for literary publications such as The Baffler and larger websites like CityLab, as well as widely respected architecture outfits like the Architectural Review and Disegno. However, it was only after I had a career of like 4 years at this point, or 3 years, but it was only after I became the architecture critic at the New Republic in 2019 that I became truly legitimated as an architecture critic by the institutions I had sidestepped through my unconventional career route. Despite the fact that, yeah, I had called myself and had been referred to by others as an architecture critic as soon as like 2017. This is all to say that despite the so-called democratizing force of the internet, in fields such as architecture, it is still institutions, be they magazines or universities or what have you, that hold the keys to authority. I say this because I don't want to give the impression that things are more egalitarian than they actually are. And because paradoxically, the blog, which gave me my voice to begin with, now sometimes seems like a detraction from the legitimacy I've gained through these other projects and work. This is difficult to reconcile, but I think it is important to be honest about these struggles, especially with students, and especially with students who want to be critics themselves. There are, of course, other dangers that come with internet notoriety. Harassment and scrutiny are obvious examples, especially if one is not male, not straight, and or not white. When the Washington Post published a video interview of me critiquing houses early in 2017, I was berated with emails insulting my haircut, my body, and my voice. Shortly after that same video went out, I was hit with a cease and desist from the real estate website Zillow, which had recently lost a massive copyright lawsuit for their use of real estate photos from independent photographers that had cost the company literally millions of dollars. And so they were, like, legally speaking, inherently cagey. However, being trained in basic literary science in college, I was sure, absolutely sure, that what I was doing fell under the purview of fair use. That is, use of materials for the purposes of, in my case, education and parody, and that the original images were modified enough by means of the captions to be considered derivative works. Luckily for me, the Electronic Frontiers Foundation came to my rescue, and they decided to take on my legal case, in doing so with the hope that it would go to trial. And the reason why they wanted it to go to trial is that it would give them an opportunity to set a legal precedent against the invocation for purposes of basically legal intimidation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is the act that makes piracy and hacking a federal crime. This is the same act that was brought against Aaron Schwartz, who was famous for downloading and disseminating scientific and academic papers, and who committed suicide in jail. I mean, we're getting into some politics here, but seems that the punishment does not exactly match the crime. But this is a common thing that people throw in these cease and desists, that when it comes to users violating a specific company's terms of service, like that, and somehow that they're violating federal law by doing so, which is not true. Fortunately, Zillow saw the writing on the wall, and that it was, as a company, in the wrong here, and that the whole debacle was over in 3 days. I mean, it was such a clear and obvious case of fair use. And the outcome in the end was more notoriety for McMansion Hell as a project, which benefited me. However, a key factor in all of this is knowing your rights and also understanding the basics of copyright law before, as they say, posting into the void. The best place to do this as students is via the university library, as issues of copyright also pertain to knowledge production and academic publishing. Many universities have a fair use week that is worth attending, if only for the free pizza. So recently, I have wondered more recently if the McMansion Hell story is replicable, if there could possibly be a successor to the blog that results in the same outcome for its practitioner. This is a worthy question, I think, because I'm invited to give these lectures to students who, in some ways, some of them want to do what I do for a living, which is to be an architecture critic in print at a major publication. And so I think personally, it's very important to be honest about whether or not it's such a thing is, like I said, replicable. Because when I was a classical musician, it wasn't until my last year of music school that we were told in like our music and business class, essentially, that most of us were not going to become unionized symphony musicians. In fact, most of us we're going to be precarious freelancers, like schlepping from gig to gig, and maybe if we're lucky, like giving enough private lessons to make ends meet, which is why they should give that lecture to you in freshman year and not at the end. But I'm all in favor of radical honesty here, which is why I've written what I've written here. And so McMansion Hell, I mean, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Its earliest precedents can be found during the heyday of postmodernism, including the humorous captioned illustrations from Venturi and Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas, and especially the 1973 book Daydream Houses of Los Angeles, which was written by the architectural critic and theorist Charles Jenks, and featured delightful, I would say, Stephen Shore-esque snapshots of these like really funky houses in Los Angeles with pithy captions underneath, calling them things like Liberace chic or like topiary fascist. I mean, it was McMansion Hell before McMansion Hell was a thing. And it's such a funny book to exist. If you can get a copy, I highly recommend it. It's very humorous. But inspiration for the tone and format of McMansion Hell owes a lot basically to like blog era internet media, such as blogs like Hyperbole and a Half and webcomics, specifically one called A Softer World, which superimposed captions on vague Polaroid photographs that were like very darkly funny and like kind of existential. And there were websites like crack.com back in the day. But more recent precedents on the internet include there were these blogs, Ugly Belgian Houses and Terrible Real Estate Photos, which were both started in like the early 2010s. And both projects followed the typical sort of blog to book pipeline that defined that era, where if like enough people read your blog, you would just get a book deal and you can just publish the blog as a book and then make lots of money and never have to do anything ever again. But neither of these practitioners became writers or critics, though in some way both projects continue, somewhat hampered by the shift from blogging to social media, during which followings had to be carried to new platforms, which often came with mixed results. But because McMansion Hell operates within the confines of Tumblr, which is a microblogging platform with social media characteristics, it can be seen as a kind of transitional media that succeeds by means of being native to the streamlined social media infrastructure that had already been established by the time 2016 rolled around. And just as Ugly Belgian Houses and Terrible Real Estate Photos were suited to the internet of the aughts in the early 2010s, McMansion Hell is also of its time. And the projects that have followed it are entirely suited to and are fully enveloped within new structures of social media, to the point where they're almost entirely image or video driven, with little to no text or writing, short or long form, involved. Some examples of these include the one-liner based kind of themed Twitter accounts that pop up every so often, like the Best of Zillow or like Cocaine Decor. The former being basically, look at this house, so ugly, oh my God. basically like kind of like the McMansion Hell dunking thing, but with like without any criticism or cultural criticism or depth. And the latter being a rather interesting collection of interiors that follow a certain self-indulgent hedonistic vibe. Big fan of Cocaine Decor, the Twitter account, personally. Instagram accounts, there are also these Instagram accounts like Dankwood Right, which like I'm sure like all of you know what Dankwood Right is at this point if you're an architecture student, which interestingly, despite its popularity, is even more specified to the niche practices of architecture and includes like some extremely funny jokes about architectural theory, like so funny. But there's also like a variety of TikTok accounts, apparently, the most interesting of which is 432 Park Avenue Hate Page, which is entirely devoted to the intense critical evisceration of Raphael Vignoli's Super Tall in New York City, to the point where the woman, like she's young, I think, who does this, like recreated the tower in Minecraft to show like just how messed up it was. I mean, like it is a project. And so like this last iteration is probably the closest analog to McMansion Hell in that it is an intense, distinctly critical project that capitalizes on the use of a new generation of social media that is frankly beyond my comprehension, thus distinctly putting me within yesterday's generation. However, the written nature of the blog and of my blog and its secondary educational purpose is what sort of lent itself to scaling up into a career as a critic. Also worth interrogating is whether or not internet projects, even those that go viral, should translate directly into a career building effort. Part of the reason McMansion Hell worked this way is because I see myself as a writer first. And while my body of work extends to such subjects as cultural criticism and a recent turn towards sports writing and creative nonfiction, I choose to write primarily about architecture as a subject simply because I love architecture more than anything else in the world, except maybe my husband. I write basically for people who don't look at buildings like you and I do. I write for people who do a double take in their cars when they pass by a particularly interesting house. People who stay home on Friday night to watch HGTV. People who interact with space as users and not as creators. People for whom architecture is the canvas upon which everyday life is painted. People who love their houses and their cities something fierce. And so when I write about architecture, I try to tell a story. I try to humanize my subject unless I find it unworthy of the gesture, in which case I resort to humor, something I believe to be imperative to the project of criticism because architecture takes itself so seriously. I mean, this is not to say that I'm not like a serious scholar despite being self-taught. I mean, I have a great love of theory and a bookshelf full of theorists whose work I enjoy and return to often. I even subscribe to Log despite how expensive it is. Still, I am not a theorist, and I do not write like a theorist unless I'm writing about concert halls from the 1970s, which is what my thesis was about. Because as a critic, my work is public-facing, and theory is not. The great privilege of theory is that it has a lovely intimacy to it, cloistered away in university libraries and heated conversations that go deep into the night. It fills long papers with languidly looping references, snippets of my pet favorites, a dash of Doug Spencer here, mixed with Pier Vittorio Aureli here, embedded gemstone-like in Times New Roman double-spaced. But criticism doesn't have that intimacy. It's all authority, panache, and performance. And so why not make the performance a good one if we're performing? Architecture schools have graduated many students of art and or architectural history, but the ones who become critics had a special gift, which is the desire and the ability to educate and inform people outside of architecture. Historically, architecture critics have been architects themselves or historians of architecture at elite or notable institutions, although a handful of the built environment's most enduring voices, such as Jane Jacobs, have been self-taught. This is in part due to the nature of the old school world of print publishing, when every major newspaper in the country had an architecture critic. Chicago just lost ours, so I mean, it's not great. A film critic, a food critic, a theater critic, a music critic, and generally the culture of criticism was public facing in these massive city newspapers. I mean, the goal of an Ada Louise Huxtable or Louis Mumford or a Nicholas Pevsner or Michael Sorkin was to act as an interlocutor between the world of architecture and the general populace, translating matters of aesthetics, history, and politics into a piece of writing that was easily accessible, and often entertaining. As much as we lionize Ada Louise Huxtable today, in one of her last columns, she compared the then unbuilt Hudson Yards to a collection of glittering dildos. There's precedence for everything. What makes a good critic isn't the ability to analyze and deconstruct a building, though that is, of course, very important, but rather the way one uses a building as a prism through which one can view life, politics, history, aesthetics, and the world and its systems, the current culture and its zeitgeist, the human element from its architect to its inhabitants, to its janitor, to the city councilor with backdoor investments in real estate, to the neighbors being evicted to make room for the era's next Lincoln Center. I mentioned the spirit of architectural criticism as a public good, and this is the main focus of what I want to discuss from here on out. I feel as though the spirit has been lost in recent decades for a number of reasons, some of them more obvious than others. There's a great quote here that I'm going to read from the Italian architectural theorist Manfredo Tifuri, one of my faves of all time, who opened his 1960s book, Theories and Histories of Architecture, with a salient observation on the state of architectural criticism. To criticize, in fact, means to catch the historical scent of phenomena, put them through the sieve of strict evaluation, show their mystifications, values, contradictions, and internal dialectics, and explode their entire charge of meanings. But in the period we live in, mystifications and brilliant aversions, historical and anti-historical attitudes, bitter intellectualizations, and mild mythologies mix themselves so inextricably in the production of art that the critic is bound to start an extremely problematic relationship with his accepted operative practice, particularly in considering the cultural tradition in which he moves, in this case, she. In fighting a cultural revolution, there exists an intimate complicity between criticism and activity. To Furry's words, despite the intense density with which he always manages to cram so many ideas into so few sentences, something I envy, remains alarmingly true today. These problems, the mystification, mythology, ahistoricism, intellectualism, complicity within exploitative economic and cultural systems embedded within the field of architecture, had already begun to emerge at mid-century, but they would reach their apex in our current era. Architecture exists in a field devoted to ideals of suffering, overwork, hero worship, and the continuing myth of an often male genius. While I conceded earlier that a certain type of architectural analysis is necessary for the production of knowledge, to say that theory doesn't have its own problems would be frankly wrong. Since the dawn of sort of what we could call like contemporary post-Peter Eisenman era of theory writing, so much of architectural writing has buried itself essentially into an increasingly internecine academic isolation in which all of the serious thinking is done in journals or small underground publications run by grad students. I mean, this is the layer of the isms and izations, the realm of rhizomes, actor network theory, new materialisms, whatever idea du jour philosophy departments have in store for us. So much so that one reads an academic journal of architecture theory and can easily forget that the topic of the discussion at hand is in fact buildings. The serious thinkers with tenure, with the exception of a few small, blessed few, very blessed, remained in this realm for their entire lives. They never, ever have to face the public. And that's not to say that like good and important research isn't done in the academy, because obviously it is. I mean, without the academy, ideas don't move forward. But rather to dispel the myth that every history theory criticism graduate inherently has the skills or even desire to become an architecture critic. On top of this layer lies sort of the domain of specialty and trade publications. That is, publications geared towards the field and ultimately the practice of architecture. Some of these, like Metropolis magazine, for example, or the Architectural Review, or the Architect's newspaper, that's different, are relatively public facing and familiar to those whose laymen happen to be interested in design. Whereas, yeah, others like Places Journal and the Architect's newspaper are tailored more to those working academically or professionally in the field of architecture or architectural history. Many of these publications are wonderful, and although the pay is unfortunately often lackluster, which if you have questions, I'm happy to answer, they have a large readership and do sincere work in tackling the various current issues and ideas within the architecture world, akin to the sort of role ArtNet or Hyperallergic play in the art world, if you're familiar. And then on top of this layer is what I've called P-architecture. I wrote sort of recently about what P-architecture is for the Architect's newspaper, and I think it's useful to quote extensively from this particular essay because it shines a light on so much of what is wrong, or at least what I think is wrong, with the state of architecture publishing. So P-architecture is essentially the architectural equivalent of vaporware. Proposed projects, ideas, and innovations that generate a lot of hype and publicity and yet never materialize. And even when they do materialize, they do so in a muddled down form. It's architecture for the click economy, a product of the internet age of short attention spans and a constant uncritical drive towards the new and shiny. P-architecture is the inevitable result of an image-driven, buzzword-laden media atmosphere where big ideas and sumptuous imagery are rewarded time and time again with attention, clicks, and opportunities over the work of up-and-coming or more critical and subversive practitioners. Its visual language is the computer rendering, and its textual language adopts the self-congratulatory tone of public relations, of savvy corporate rhetoric willing to capitalize on the issue du jour, often conveniently covering up a brand or firm's unsavory contributions to the conditions from which those issues arise. We are living in unprecedented times with issue X and issue Y weighing heavily on our horizon, presenting us with an uncertain future, one blurb will say. While another parrots, the problem of X requires bold and innovative new solutions at the intersections of Y and Z. And the time for action? Oh, it's always now. Likewise, the solutions at these intersections of Y and Z are always surface level, technocratic at best, and frankly tone deaf at worst. Their authors believe uncritically that design can and will solve all of our problems, from climate change to income inequality. We'll solve the novel coronavirus with shipping container hospitals, climate change with floating cities, and income inequality with 3D printed houses. Conveniently, all of these solutions are very saleable, generating attention and income, click-based ad revenue or commissions. It's all the same, really, to those peddling them. It's a win-win situation. Your firm ends up on the front page of Dezeen, plus you end up looking forward-thinking and compassionate to the plight of the unsophisticated masses who could truly benefit from your bold and innovative ideas. Most of the time, you don't even have to go to the trouble of building anything. Because here's the thing, producing buildings exposes architecture to criticism, both aesthetically and politically. The act of making a building grounds architecture in the real world, exposing complicity in the exploitative systems that facilitate and accompany the production of space, such as capitalism, late, fossil, or otherwise, labor exploitation, income and racial inequality, oppressive political regimes, predatory financial institutions, and so on. By comparison, producing images is really easy. It's cheap. It doesn't require changes in a firm's own practices or even reflecting on what practices need changing. Images and PR spin can be easily attached to a timely problem, a new technological development like Bitcoin, a brand, or a personality like Bjarke Ingels. Even if the project doesn't quite fit the brief du jour, it can be shoehorned into the public eye regardless with the right combination of smooth publicity and content delivery. I mean, it's hard to say what a solution to this problem would look like, right? As it's a systemic problem involving the entire industries of architecture and architecture journalism. There are obvious correctives, such as diversifying workplaces and editorial reform, but these don't really get at the heart of the issue, which is that architecture in an inequitable society will always be inequitable. And an inequitable architecture will resist, or should that fail, absorb the very project of criticism. It's telling how progressive practices such as Peter Barber's and Langenthal and Vassal's have in recent years been patronizingly held up as avatars of architecture's, quote, good conscience. The most powerful and successful architecture firms in the world thrive simply because the status quo rewards them for their work. They win huge contracts from NGOs and corporations, as well as huge publicity opportunities from other NGOs and corporations. The industry is the way it is because it is safe. Action and real novelty are risky, but safety is profitable, and that profitability incentivizes homogeneity and ideological fecklessness. Good word. The same media landscape that sustains these behemoths also manages to toss a few crumbs to the small firms whose buildings are glamorous enough to look good on an Instagram feed. And this gives the appearance of neutrality and opportunity that keeps architects feeding into the image economy. Here's the thing about print, and I speak from experience here, being someone who works in print. Print had limitations in terms of how much it could publish, right? Which allowed some discretion as to whose work was worthy of publication. Gatekeepers, as I said earlier. The implications of this editorial control often manifested itself in cultural elitism, but at the same time allowed for the rise of the architecture critic as a central and galvanizing figure. I always think actually about how Frank Gehry said at Ada Louise Huxtable's funeral that he lived in fear of her for years. Which, like, God, that's my goal in life. That's all I want. Even if the architecture critic often played into these existing cultural systems, she still became a source of legitimate fear and respect in the eyes of architects. Today, the internet allows such an immense quantity of dialect published architectural content that criticism as an institution is just basically in over its head. I mean, this would be the case even if critical institutions hadn't been completely undermined or, eliminated over the last 30 years. The culture of criticism, as a result, has to focus on the biggest fish in the sea, like Bjarke Ingels, like Frank Gehry, like Thomas Heatherwick, the people who get the most attention, generate the most clicks, and the most outrage. Like, I have to write an essay this week about Thomas Heatherwick, and between you and me, I'm really tired of writing about this man who was mean to me at a party. Anyways. Don't have heroes. The culture of criticism, as a result, has to be the biggest fish in the sea. For that is what the general public knows and is what publications want. I mean, also we're talking about the people who do the shiniest buildings, right? Like the Vessel, for example, which is just like the vessel, is something I've written about, and now I have to write about it again because people are killing themselves by jumping off of it, is just something that is like, architecture critics are like, it's like moth to a flame. It's just like the perfect encapsulation of so much that is wrong with the field and so much that is wrong with like also like urbanism and, architecture worship and what have you, that it's inevitable that we have to write about it. But that doesn't mean that I can't be resentful of that. So hence, in addition to being a failure of architecture, PR architecture is also a failure of criticism. It's a failure of curation. I mean, it's a failure of journalistic adaptation to a changing media landscape. PR, public relations itself, is like the very language of adaptation and co-optation. It's to fight a battle with PR is like pitching a fight with the Hydra. I mean, and perhaps the most simple immediate solution to the PR problem is for like a cultural shift in the field of architecture towards self-awareness, self-criticism, and self-skepticism regarding innovations, technologies, and proposals it knows to be cynical, impossible, or quite frankly, stupid. For media, this is more difficult. For the entire ecosystem of digital media it just squeaks by off of like outrage, right? Clickbait and attention grabbing. In the twilight years of print architecture criticism, the time is long since overdue for new, more diverse institutions of criticism to be built, and this is important, allowed to become as established and reputable as the old ones. These two solutions are both band-aids patching up leaks in what is a systemic crisis between architecture and a media that are both dependent on the vagaries and injustices of global capitalism. But since PR architecture makes up so much of the architectural press, a la social media, I mean, how every day I wake up and I see some insane thing getting posted on like Design Boom or like Arc Daily that's just like so-and-so at so-and-so architects has like, proposed a new solution to the coronavirus called we wear giant spheres around ourselves. And this is very novel and interesting and not at all a ploy for attention. I mean, it's like, but yeah, so this is a sad, sorry state of the architectural press, in my opinion. And on the other hand, the academy makes, for better or for worse, makes up so much of architectural thinking. And because previously reliable outlets for criticism, such as major newspaper, and even now, like ever volatile digital media companies, like companies that trade hands like every year or collapse or something terrible happens, they're increasingly going up in smoke. And so you might be asking at this point, like, what the hell, man? Okay, start new publications that are diverse. Let that criticism happen. Cool, easier said than done, right? The same question I posited earlier remains. How long does it take for a person, a writer, much less an entire publication, to become financially stable and high quality enough to survive, much less become legitimatized? I hope that someday the means and the institutional support will become available to build those new spaces that lead criticism forward into a new, more egalitarian renaissance. However, I run a blog, and I run it by myself because I can't afford to pay anyone else a fair wage to write for me. And has that blog become over the years legitimated or at least accepted? Sure. Are individual projects like McMansion Hell the way to build what we're calling the new criticism? Probably not. There was like a little bit I wrote recently in a letter to a young architect published in the Architectural Review, where it says, what is becoming increasingly clear is that critical intervention in architecture must happen collectively through organizing within the academy, the firm, and across the discipline. This is a beautiful project because it involves every single one of us architectural practitioners, critics, and crucially workers. As you embark on your career as an architect or critic or historian, you must always remember that your critical voice matters and is essential to making architecture a better, more equitable, more ethical, and yes, more self-reflective profession. Because this is a collective project, it matters not if you are a sole practitioner, a grad student, a blogger, an employee stuck drawing wall sections in Revit for 8 hours a day. There is always an opportunity for subversion and activism. Personally, as I mentioned earlier, the winning strategy for me as a writer has been to use the notoriety of McMansion Hell to bring architecture criticisms to other publications, large, widely circulated publications like The Atlantic or The New Republic, but also even niche or literary publications like The Baffler and political outlets like Jacobin, whose pages don't usually see much or sometimes even any discussions of architecture. The obvious problem with this, I mean, really obvious, is that some people will be given these opportunities much more readily than others. following the basic prejudices of society with regards to race, class, ability, age, and gender. A funny story. It's not funny. For the first 6 months of McMansion Hell and even after, everyone assumed I was a man. Like, and an even less funny story, on every panel I've ever been on, I have been at least 15 years younger than everyone else and often the only woman. In 2021. In 2021. I mean, yeah. The other winning strategy has been to utilize sort of new crowdfunding structures such as Patreon, or in now Substack, which is becoming sort of more ascendant in writing, to secure enough of a living wage to keep my voice independent, very important, and my life stable, even more important. This is something that some projects use, such as the freelance organizing working group / media reporting outlet Study Hall, which if you write and you want to write for a living, very, very cool, very, very useful. Check it out. They basically have forums that give you like all the insider media gossip that like you would usually have to like go to J school and like build your rapport with like a bunch of weirdos in New York to get. Like they just have it now on Study Hall, and like you can ask questions there where it's like how much. So the Atlantic emailed me back and says they can pay me this much for this article of this length for web, not print. Is that a reasonable amount or should I demand more? Like, what have you been paid for something similar? Like, you can ask questions like that. And that's incredibly important because in freelancing, you don't really have like any power like you would if you were like a member of a newsroom. And so you have to sort of and this has worked to the advantage of publications for a really long time because they pit freelancers against one another. And now that like freelancers are starting to sort of collaborate and discuss their rates and discuss things like this, it's actually extremely good because like people can basically call publications out on their crap and say like, I heard from somewhere else that like you pay this instead, or just simply asking like, hey, like I think that's a little too low. Can we do this instead? And it works. If you actually ask that, like 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, okay, because they've done it for other people. They just are lowballing you because maybe you've never written for them before. This is very important to know if you want to write for a living. But yeah. So I should mention though also, Patreon has extreme numerous flaws. I mean, the biggest one is that like all of us who like make money on Patreon are basically reliant on the survival of this large, semi-volatile and vague tech startup. However, and also we pay a huge chunk of our income into Patreon as a service like every month. But I will say the independence it gives to individuals and groups in terms of a ready-made platform they can use to fund themselves and distribute content is still relatively new enough to be considered a game changer. And now this is the case too with Substack. Which is again more prevalent in writing. If McMansion Hell was made like this year instead of 2016, it would have been entirely on Substack. That would have been the way to monetize it, but it wasn't. So, etc. But I do have a Substack, unrelated. Yes. There's also some good news too, which is that though architecture criticism's reckoning with race has like an extremely long way to go, there is starting to be change at the editorial level, and it's starting to move in like a better direction, albeit what feels like a glacial pace. There are also organizations like the Architecture Lobby, which organize within architecture to make it more equitable, as well as a handful of nonprofits, such as Critical Minded, which is devoted to funding and supporting emerging critics of color. Because let's be frank here, with a few notable and wonderful exceptions, Architecture Critic is about the whitest job you can get, present company included. The key, though, to what I see is necessary to a radical transformation of architectural criticism is an attitude adjustment. For me, the future of architecture criticism will be radically accessible and gloriously irreverent. I mean, and the purpose of saying this is not to like wag a finger at the ivory tower or old guard architecture critics, most of whom are gone now. This is sort of the rallying cry of someone who has stumbled upon a way to coax people out of architecture into critically examining the built environment. I mean, superimposing arrows and witty captions on pictures of ugly, oversized houses isn't effective because it's funny or gimmicky. It's effective because got a call. Sorry, I'm on my phone. Hold on, let me reclaim my train of thought here. It's effective because it teaches people to look at buildings and see, in their hidden language, truths about society and culture. What else is a clueless, cheap 2-story portico if not a statement of wealth and power reduced to inadvertent self-mockery? I mean, we can bemoan the death of real criticism and worry about its future until the last light above the desk of the last newspaper architecture critic goes out for the last time, an event that is becoming closer and closer in the future. Or we can build something new in tone, choice of language, visual cues, and medium, yet still constructive and productive. We can sustain criticism by giving it a new audience, the audience it deserves, anyone affected by the change architecture creates in the built environment, which is to say literally everyone. Criticism isn't just one branch of the big sprawling tree that is architecture. It is an innate sense that everyone has, but is rarely cultivated. People already see things in buildings that they find ugly, bland, stupid, insincere, pretentious. And people already critique the politics of architecture every time they protest displacement, border walls, or unethical labor practices. So is the problem that people no longer care about real criticism, or is that real criticism doesn't care about people? Our duty as critics is to educate and empower the critic and others. If we fail to do that, we will not be able to build a future for our work or the project of criticism in general. After all, what use is criticism if we write to an audience made only of people like ourselves? Those who've heard about the decline in quality or courtesy or about the erosion of norms are often just fearful of the status quo changing. But who exactly benefits from the status quo? And what status quo hasn't already been eroded by the insanity that is the current political and cultural landscape, or by the chaotic hegemonic rise of technology and its intentional disruption of pretty much like everything on Earth. The world is on fire, literally, in some places. Yet so much pundit class energy is devoted to bemoaning the death of civility at the hands of angry Twitter users, or the decay of thought or language because teens prefer to make memes instead of reading capital L literature. I mean, instead of joining in such useless hand-wringing, architecture criticism would be wiser to harness the power of irreverence, constructively channel the energy of anger, and ultimately redirect the innate human desire to make sense of our senseless, deeply upsetting world towards building a better one, a more informed one, and yes, a truly critical one. Because the world is not going to get easier, even though Biden is president now. The political fracas we find ourselves in will not automatically revert to the last period in history in which you felt comfortable. These waters are not only uncharted, but they're rising quickly. And there's never been a time in the history of the built environment where the urgency and spirit of activism and criticism are so desperately needed. The field of architecture is not a friendly one. It's not an equitable one. And frankly, more often than not, it's not even an inspiring one either. And so I leave you with this. I'm here to tell you, as students and as practitioners of architecture, that you never, ever have to accept things the way they are. In fact, it is your duty to change them. Thank you. That's it. That's my bit.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really enjoyed your talk. I have a couple of things I'd like to ask you. But let me ask the students in the audience if they would like to ask any questions or make any comments, if they could do so through the chat window.
I can't see the chat window because I'm on my phone. So
I can read them to you.
Okay, perfect.
So I would encourage you guys to start a dialogue, because I think this is a really important talk in terms of how architecture has been, and more importantly for you, will be situated moving forward, and how it's impacted kind of by the world that you live in and inhabit virtually and literally every day. And certainly the virtual world has consumed our lives like never before for the past year. We're just a few weeks away from being a full year online here at USF.
Yeah.
It was Friday the 13th of March. I remember it well.
Oh my God.
the last time I was in a room with colleagues or students. One of the great things you said towards the end of your talk is some to the effect of the charge is to educate and empower the critics and others. And I really like that line because I think it does talk about how people can, and like you say, in many ways, lay people can be educated to have a kind of informed opinion. And to educate, that can sound a bit high and mighty, right? But to create an environment where people can take something away so they can comment meaningfully on the world around them. And, I was thinking about Huxtable last night after we talked, and I really, I don't know that much about her career, but she was at the New York Times for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then she was at the Wall Street Journal for another almost 15 years.
Yeah.
She started off at MoMA
Mm-hmm.
way back in the day. So, and I think she authored 8 or 10 books or something. And I think this was like a real powerful voice. I think the anecdote about Frank Gehry is hilarious. But these critics I don't know if they still do, and this is something you might talk about, hold great sway within the discourse about
Mm-hmm.
the built environment with respect to the public world. Like you mentioned Lewis Mumford. I mean, you mentioned the giants, Lewis Mumford, Ada Louise Huxtable. I don't know if you mentioned Goldberger, but
Oh
certainly
yeah.
Goldberger, now Michael Kimmelman.
Mm-hmm.
And for many years.
Now, I don't know. Michael Kimmelman has other projects now that are, he's like, his new job is like doing some kind of like audio related thing for the New York Times with like smart technology or something. But anyways, your point stands.
Yeah. And Nikolai, is it Orosov?
Yeah.
For many years. And but the New York Times, not always, but tends to be kind of New York centric.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to look at buildings in and around the city, not always.
Mm-hmm.
And people may feel as though that's more, maybe they feel that's less relevant to their world. What is your take on the role of the critic locally? And by that, I mean in a city like Tampa.
Yeah.
It's a sort of mid-sized city, a lot of architecture being built as we speak. There's a $3 billion construction project. I mean, a chunk of the city's being rebuilt now. And if we live in a kind of isolated time for the students in the audience. If you haven't been downtown for a while, you're going to be shocked by what it looks like now compared to a year ago. So there's this huge infusion of capital and energy and architecture and buildings into the downtown. How do you define the role on a kind of more local level, the role of the critic?
It's really difficult, actually, because so much of local criticism has just basically disappeared in the course of the last 30 years. This is partially because, like, as you said, like the New York Times, while being, New York's local paper, is really like a national publication. The New York centric stuff is like basically relegated to the margins at this point. But back in the day before, the internet, when everything became completely decentralized, media like television and newspapers and radio had like a certain kind of sway and allowed for this sort of concentrated consumption that was shared between many people. Like you could go somewhere and be like, yeah, did you listen to that thing last night? And like chances are somebody did. And so because of that centralization and because things were so local and they could be local, that was what allowed the critic, whether be they the architecture critic or the or the music critic or theater critic or what have you, to have that kind of sway. And so when everything is completely decentralized in the age of the internet, like everything has to take a very broad national view. I mean, like, for example, I write for the New Republic, which is a national publication. And so my columns about projects or buildings have to be sort of broader in scope, despite them being essentially local to somebody, right? And so that changes the nature of the columns, because it means that I have to make a broader political statement that can be applied to other things. And so I say political because it's the New Republic. And I think, and it's actually a travesty, in my opinion. I mean, in Chicago, our architecture critic position at the Chicago Tribune is done. In Los Angeles, like after Christopher Hawthorne went to go work for the city of LA, that position is just in limbo, not officially canceled, but at the same time, no one is filling it. And there isn't a search. If there were a search, I would know. And it's even worse now. I mean, those are two of the biggest cities in the entire country. They are the two biggest cities in the entire country. Chicago is the third biggest city. And if two of the biggest cities in the entire country don't have an architecture critic, and the New York Times, like, yeah, Kimmelman was doing architecture criticism for a while, but it wasn't like it was in the heyday, like the Huxtable days, or even the Goldberger days, where you would have like a column like every month, or like at the arrival of like a new building, and there are new buildings going up in New York all the time. Kimmelman, like, before he kind of switched gears into whatever he's doing now, like only would publish like something about architecture like every few months, like even like every half a year. I mean, it really has just been completely decimated. And he sort of filled the space by becoming more of an urban reporter, which is a different thing than being an architecture critic. He's a really interesting example because it shows you just the kind of flexibility that like a lot of people who work at these like big print publications have to have. And so it's even if that's what it's like, right, for the three biggest cities in the country, like a city like Tampa or like Greensboro or where I went to school, or even Baltimore where I went to graduate school, like there's no hope for like ever having that kind of like hegemony in the local paper again. Also, you know, the death of print is like a whole big thing too.
Well,
and so like the
yeah,
role then becomes like, how do you create new critical institutions? Because and how do you disseminate them? How do you, you know, gain notoriety and become, and this is actually quite interesting because like, you know, in some ways a lot of writing about building that may or may not be considered architecture criticism, but sort of falls within a similar vein, is now done by, for example, in Chicago, like websites that are like hyper focused on local development, like Block Hub Chicago, which is now expanding from being a site that documents basically the exploits of developers and whoever builds in Chicago to now taking over like or like integrating with like an old defunct community driven publication, DNA Info, which for many years was like, you know, how to know what's going on, like kind of in the underbelly of Chicago development and politics, neighborhoods and things like neighborhood politics, things like that. And so you're starting to see now, as like we finally adjusted to the shock and awe, I guess, of the internet age and like what it's done to print and what it's done to traditional public criticism. You're starting to see now these like local institutions being built like online that very much have a lot to do with the built environment. And so then it becomes a matter of like the business structure for that. Say, I mean, first you need to have legitimacy, so like getting funding, hiring reporters who are already like well known in the area, or inviting or creating a job position that incentivizes someone with a certain expertise to move. I mean, that is, I think, perhaps like an easier task than reinventing like all of architectural criticism in print again. And so you start to see, like it's becoming a much more hybridized and I would say nebulous kind of field where like, yeah, there's writing about development, there's writings about neighborhood change on the local level. And these are all very important like elements in architectural criticism without getting into the aesthetics of the buildings. And so it follows that like the logical step from these kinds of like hyper local publications, including things like, you know, like city papers, like, you know, paper weeklies and stuff like that. Like
that's actually one place where you will see a small amount of that, the weekly.
Yeah, and the weeklies are so important, and like they're also in a fight against attrition. I mean, and so like through those kinds of like hyper localized and like really kind of scrappy like go get them kind of publications that have always been like a little bit subversive in a way, like that's really, I think, where you'll see architecture criticism start to spring up again. But I mean, it's not ever, I don't think, going to be like it was, you know, at mid-century. And I think something important to keep in mind is that like we should maybe perhaps make peace with that and devote ourselves and our energies to finding new ways to continue the project of criticism with the means and in the communities that we have to work with.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because if I put on my optimistic hat,
yes,
I think, how do I get my information? Well, when I pop open my computer every day, the first thing I see is the front page of the New York Times. And that's where I get my information. And it seems to me that communicating digitally could allow for a kind of resurgence of critical thinking when it comes to architecture and public commentary, the Mumfords, the Ada Louises and stuff like that, the Sorkins. If you know, the thing about the New York Times is that it's so much more than a newspaper now online.
Yeah, it's an institution.
And it's this dynamic thing. It links you to hundreds and thousands of stories. It has videos. It has interviews. I mean, it's so dynamic compared to the Sunday paper, which I still get, but it's, you know, you move through it very differently.
Yeah.
And I see, and I say hopefully the possibility of a resurgence of a kind of criticism that's different from the kind of commentary, which is another thing, right? I mean, like your blog is criticism, but it's a kind of commentary that allows us to kind of take a look at ourselves culturally.
Yes.
I mean, that's what I think is really interesting about your thing. And it's entertainment. It is funny. And if the students have not looked at this is a great blog. I mean, it is really engaging. And you scroll through it, and some of you might see your house in it, so watch out. Or
I haven't done one in Florida for a while, so maybe not.
Yeah, but the that's one form. I think of what is it? F your Noguchi coffee table.
Oh, that's really funny.
On Tumblr, which is great.
That's really funny.
It's brutal, and it's for designers to get the joke. The joke's on you.
Exactly.
It's about the self-consciousness of how we arrange our spaces.
Absolutely.
And it is deadly funny. You mentioned a couple that I don't know about, and I'll look up. So there's that realm of commentary, and part of it is very insular. Like if you're part of the club, you really get it.
Dank Lloyd Wright is like a great example of that.
Which one?
Dank Lloyd Wright, the Instagram.
I don't even know that, so we'll look at it.
It's really funny. But yeah, no, I agree. And so, yeah, and I feel that very distinctly because, I mentioned earlier in my sort of talk that I have like these two lives now that I lead, which is like one is like as the commentator, as like the McMansion Hell blogger, and the other is as like this person who publishes like about architecture bi-monthly in a national magazine, sort of like what Sorkin did at The Nation back in the day.
That's right.
And so it's like these projects are obviously linked, right? And they operate on different scales. But at the same time, I don't know. I think, like I also said, I think that perhaps like the future of all of this, right, is to have people at magazines, like at like widely circulated, and some of them are more venerated than others, but places like if we're talking about venerated places like the New Republic or like The Nation, which doesn't have an architecture critic anymore, but could potentially, right? And they could potentially have an architecture critic again. And or places like The Atlantic, or places,
well, it has to be valued, right? I mean, the New Republic does this because it values the voice that you offer as a regular member of their writing team, a regular contributor. And I think that's so important. I'll tell you another place that I've infrequently seen, but occasionally seen interesting criticism is in Harper's, right? I mean, more of a literary magazine. And I saw the most scathing review I've ever seen there years ago. It was years ago. And it called the Holocaust Museum a kind of theme park.
Oh, I've read this. That review is like blew my mind when I read it. I mean, it's such a poignant review of like how we fetishize trauma and things like, anyways. Oh, I could get into that. But yeah, no, and The Baffler too. Like these are literary magazines. And I mean, Harper's is huge compared to The Baffler, but still like that same milieu. I mean, N+1, for example, also has an architecture critic, Thomas de Michaud, who is perhaps one of my favorite architecture critics who is working today.
Which publication is that?
N+1, which is like a literary publication that's published like, I don't know, can't remember if it's quarterly or bi-monthly or what have you, but very good. But it's in that same kind of like literary, high production value kind of space. And those kinds of spaces, like those literary spaces like Harper's, for example, or the New Yorker, right, sort of automatically lend themselves to having architecture criticism. And now we actually get into something interesting. So you might ask, like, why isn't that the case? Why isn't there like a regular like architecture critic publishing? And I think that actually has more to do with the fact that back in the day, like architecture critics were salaried members of publications.
That's right.
With, you had to provide like a job and benefits for those people. And now that's really not how it works anymore for critics. Most critics that I know, with the exception of those who are salaried writers at big newspapers, like Inga Saffron, for example, at the Philadelphia Inquirer, or Mark Lamster at the Dallas Morning News. They are salaried employees there, and they have a desk. But most people I know who write about architecture for like literary magazines, like for the New Yorker, or for the New Republic, like myself, or The Nation, right, are on contract. They are either freelancers. If they write individual articles, like every so often, then they're freelancers for the most part. Or if they're like me and they have a regular column, I'm not an employee of the New Republic. I have a contract with the New Republic that specifies a certain number of articles per year, and every year that contract is renegotiated. And so if my column does well and people enjoy it, or it gets like a certain number of clicks or whatever, then I get to keep that position. And also like whether or not like my work is satisfactory to the powers that be. So there's no it's like a lot of jobs on contract, but that's much cheaper than having a salaried position. And so, but in a lot of places, when the bigger the publication, the rarer it is for them to offer contracts to individual writers. It's a lot of the time it's more like, again, like freelancer based, and that is just like, while economical, it's like inherently antithetical to the idea of having like an established critic, and even contracts are precarious. And so this is sort of getting into more of like an economics and like labor relations reason as to why things are so different, because once publications realize that they could they're business. It's not to follow the editorial staff or anything like that, but publications are a business and they have a bottom line.
Yeah.
And when they realized, especially with online, especially with the coming of the internet, that they wouldn't have to pay somebody to have a desk and have benefits and stuff, that they can get somebody else to do it who's could be quite talented to do it for cheaper, then yeah, that gutted things. And that is an unfortunate reality. And the answers to that, clearly, like, yeah, with criticism, like, we have to live in a society that values that values a culture of criticism. And frankly, we don't. And I don't know if there's anything that I, as a critic, or others like in the field of architecture, can do or say to convince massive publications with certain budgets to have critics again, because then you're competing against the bottom line. And that's unfortunately something I just don't have answers for.
Yeah,
I wish I
because
did.
It was the film critic, it was the food critic, it was the person who would maybe critique and review high culture, a ballet, an opera. There was a whole dedication to a review of the arts.
Yeah. And we're living in like the last gasp of that. With like regards to like classical music, there used to be a classical music critic in every city, and now I think like Alex Ross at the New Yorker's maybe like the last one.
Yeah.
And that's just devastating. Like when I think about that, I find it just so incredibly sad. Like and it's like, this is a very American phenomenon, because, for example, in Britain, for example, there's like a much healthier culture of criticism with architecture critics at major newspapers all across that country.
Right.
And so I really think that it's a historical development that happened, again, for like social and economic reasons. America is just like, as a country and as a culture, just like inherently ruthless in terms of like gutting whatever is possible in order to save or make money. And if you don't have like a broader like concept of like the public good, which is something that is under constant attack in this country, then you're fighting an uphill battle, and that becomes a political problem, much in as much as it is a cultural problem. And the solutions to that are political solutions that involve rebuilding trust in the public as a concept.
Right. Well,
and the public good.
I think one important thing that you talk about is that impacts everyone, because there's this sense that those who consume, say, architectural criticism or urban critique are kind of the so-called cultural elites, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's really important is that there's a real bottom line to this that impacts everyone. Like, if your neighborhood and your community is made better by fine public spaces and by the ability to move through those public spaces safely, and to be a consumer within the public realm that supports something as simple as going and buying food or buying a pair of shoes or whatever without having to schlep all the way to the mall or simply sit at home and order them online. The value of your house goes up if you have those kind of amenities. And I think there's this other awareness, although it's, there's an awareness that there's value in my property, not through the McMansionness of it, but by the location of it.
The land,
and the amenities beyond my front yard that are within, maybe walking distance or bike riding distance as opposed to hopping in the car. And the more people are kind of tuned to that, the better, surely. And that's maybe where some of these things can touch home in a way that's more direct, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and also like one of the big projects that, for example, Michael Sorkin was to link architecture to broader issues that affect all of us. And by doing that, he became like a writer who was beloved outside of architecture, especially in like the political circles in which he was a member, which is to say like sort of left-wing political circles. Like there are people on the left who know who Michael Sorkin is and who don't know anything about architecture.
Sure.
But because he was able to connect it to such cogent political and such urgent political issues. And that's sort of also been my project at the New Republic. And it has to be, because you're not dealing with the hyperlocal when you're writing for a national publication. And so we return again to this dichotomy of like, yes, there is a way for like people to give people or to get people to care about architecture criticism through like, I guess, dismantling this like dichotomy of like elite consumers of the art and the public by relating it to issues that affect everybody. But at the same time, with the death of, and that comes with, that's a very like, of course, broad speaking goal. But at the same time, like the death of local political and cultural coverage is devastating, and is a cultural problem in and of itself. And so how these two things interact and how they reconcile is something that I consider fascinating, if bleak. And it's difficult, to say. I mean, I would love to be the architecture critic of the Chicago Tribune, but that position is gone. That was actually my dream in life. And after that happened a month ago, so I was like, I cracked open an extra beer. But it was, don't have dreams. That's really the lesson. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, it's really a difficult scenario we find ourselves in. And so like, yeah, we come to these same solutions, like write for national publications that are broad and wide ranging, and that will maybe like value your editorial voice. I mean, I had to do a lot of writing for other publications, including as a columnist at Curbed, which I wrote for 3 years, writing about the culture of home and consumption, with regards to a lot of mass media like HGTV, things like that. That was a whole body of work of mine. And then back in the beginning of the coronavirus, Curbed was bought out by New York Magazine. And everyone there was fired, basically. And so my editor was fired, like my contract was ended. And even, I mean, it's just, it's like like I said, it's like the Hydra. I mean, like you get somewhere and then, I mean, it's just, again, like the same bloody ruthlessness of the bottom line that guts everything. But anyways, I did a lot of writing that was concentrated and specific and very regularly published, which is another key thing that people look for. Like you can publish on a very consistent basis, that bodes well for your reliability as a content producer.
We have an interesting question about, give us your thoughts on this. The question is from Mason. Your discussion and blog remind me of how I have been wondering how technologies, applications, and buildings of the future could be influenced by the behavior and values of today's teens and young adults who will one day be design leaders in their 30s.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on this matter.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. As they say, the kids are all right. I like kind of am in a weird sort of transitional generation where I'm not like an older millennial, like, my husband's 35, I'm 27. But there's a sort of a big generational difference between him and myself, because he was a cogent teenager when the Iraq War was happening, for example, and that was very politically motivating for him, whereas I was a child. And so like you see, things change so differently between generations, even separated by like short numbers of years. And so for me, like I come from like a generation where I grew up with the internet back in like I was in middle school, for example, when MySpace was a thing, and Facebook was open to the public when I was in high school. So I was a digital native in a way, and grew up with like blog culture and things like that. But like social media like descended on this earth when I was like approaching adulthood. And so of course like that informed my approach, you know, with McMansion Hell. But like even but now, I mean, for me, like my sister, for example, is a couple years younger, but she like uses TikTok and Instagram and all these things that I like can't figure out, or like, or just like maybe not necessarily figure out, but like I'm kind of like more inclined to watch like compilations of TikToks on like YouTube or whatever than like actually have the app, which I kind of find to be unnavigable. Like I actually like this is the first time like I've ever like felt, oh, I'm definitely in a different generation now. But one of the great things about that I've seen from so many like young people people like slightly younger than me, is that like on TikTok, for example, there are people who like basically do the McMansion Hell bit on TikTok, which honestly I love, because like I like can't figure out TikTok. If somebody else who's like really funny wants to do it, like, and wants to use that medium, like that's fine with me. I don't own the concept of making fun of houses. And so like it seems that there's like a general generational shift between, and when it comes to like architecture, when it comes to like the sort of like aspirations that we have architecturally speaking. And it's so fascinating to see that it's not just McMansions, because like half of McMansions are like, half of the McMansion Hell thing is like a lot of people my age just like hate what their parents liked, and our parents liked McMansions. Whereas like with the TikTok generation, now you see like things like the 432 Park Avenue hate account, which is devoted to basically mercilessly dissecting, like in a very like non-technical way, frankly, this one single building built by a very famous architect in New York City, perhaps like now one of the most notable buildings in New York City. And so you see like the same kind of irreverence, I think, come from like younger people, because to be frank, the world is like a little bit dire for us. I mean, as young people, like as teenagers especially. I mean, imagine being a teenager right now and like reading like on the news like all of this like despicable stuff about climate change, and like basically like the collapse of so many of our institutions in America. And like you go to college and college costs like $100,000, you know. I mean, really, like even my generation, I'll never be able to own a house. I mean, like what do you say to people like who are faced with such an increasingly difficult situation politically and existentially? And so I think that that inherently drives generations towards the same kind of like momentum for change that I think, to not to be like self-aggrandizing, but it's the same kind of like huge cultural and technological upsets that brought us the dawn of modernism at the beginning of the second industrial revolution. I mean, we're living in a society that's fundamentally completely different than it was 30 years ago. And so, or I guess 40 years ago now. And so it's fascinating to me when you live in like when you live amongst such political, technological, and social upheaval, inherently that's going to shift and have material effects on the production of architecture. And so I think that when people who are of like, you know, my age or your age or younger than you, my hope, and I really think that this perhaps will come to fruition, is that we'll see again like a much broader ranging socially conscious architecture on the scale of like what modernism was, say in like the time of like the Bauhaus or like Le Corbusier, this like grand idea that like through work, through all of these changes, we can like harness them instead of having them abuse us, essentially. People always forget about that. So much of the Bauhaus was not so much that like we use technology to make our lives better, but like we understand that like technology can bring about drudgery, but in response we have to like use it to bring about pleasure and joy and art and things that are worth living for. And I think that, you know, because we live in like these such challenging times, like my hope is that architectural practitioners will move beyond like this kind of like weird techno gimmicky stuff that they're doing, whether it's parametricism or Bitcoin houses or whatever the hell like Thomas Heatherwick is up to these days, and instead like look towards like, yeah, we have these technologies, but like we have to interrogate them too. And so I mean, I think that actually the second industrial revolution is such a cogent period of study for a time like ours, because not only did we have like the early modernists who would like then go on to be like really big, important people. But I mean, we also, or like the seeds of early modernism, so to speak, but we also had like William Morris, for example, and the arts and crafts movement, which took a totally different way look at technology, like, 30 years earlier, from the Bauhaus, or however many years earlier. But
well, yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think
so
it's very,
same big technological changes, totally different reactions.
yeah.
Uh,
And I think that, the thing about architecture is that it can't compete with media. I mean, it tries to perhaps, but it can't
oh
really
yeah,
compete with media
no,
and with information and with technology at the pace that it's moving. It really
it
needs to
can't.
be a different animal.
I
And you
Yeah,
get, you produce things that are so short-lived if
yeah.
you play that game.
I mean, yeah. I mean, we all have to buy a new iPhone every 5 years because ours turns to sludge if you hold on to it long enough. I mean, it's like, well, it's also like, I mean, architecture. We always think of architecture. This is a good point, that we always think of architecture as this thing with like permanent endurance, that like we're building for the ages or whatever. But the average lifespan of like a commercial building in the United States is like 30 years.
Well, it's
Which
based on amortization tables too,
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely. And also
Yeah,
like rates of
yeah,
depreciation that you can write off your taxes. I mean, it is
yeah,
a
yeah,
whole
yeah,
arcane financial structure. And
yeah.
I think actually what's so fascinating about like our current sort of political movements driven by young people is that like they just project that. Like instead of trying to like work within such basically insipid and craven
Yeah.
systems that govern the built environment, saying like actually that these problems have political solutions and that they require political movements to change. uh, and that's where you start to get things like, this is not necessarily young organizations, but like the architecture lobby, for example, where it's like if we want to actually like have power in architecture, that means like organizing and working within the field to fix our own house, so to speak, before we can claim to like better the world for others. And also building broader political power that aligns nicely with, for example, like construction, which is a whole part of architecture, the labor of construction, which is considered to be like blue collar labor, and architecture is considered to be white collar labor. But in reality, like if you are sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, like I said, drawing wall sections in Revit, what makes you any different than a guy banging a hammer? Like you are just as alienated as the construction worker is. You are sitting in a room full of other people who do the same thing just like you for 8 hours a day. I mean, you're working in the Revit factory. And so the big cultural shift that's starting to happen is like people are starting to realize like, oh, like when I graduate from architecture school, I'm like not going to be like the unique, like bespoke, detailed sole practitioner mover of the earth that I got to be when I was doing studio. You know,
Hmm.
I'm most likely going to be working in a massive firm. Like I used to be friends with like this guy in New York who's like extremely smart and extremely funny. He's in LA now, doing something else. And he used to be the guy who was responsible for double checking all of the dimensions of like screws in the drawings for like SOM's buildings in Hudson Yards. Like that was his job all day, was double checking like details like that.
Hmm.
And that is like mind numbing work. And some of that work will be automated, but then that becomes a labor question also, right? So I mean, it's important to recognize that like architecture has the potential to change things, but those changes have to be connected to a broader political movement that builds power, and that makes change, that deals with the things that make change, not that directly affect the built environment, but aren't necessarily like inherently tethered to it. Like
Hmm.
for example, land use, right? Or for example, like predatory lending by developers or whatever, like these are political issues. And displacement, gentrification, political issues, not design problems, not
Hmm.
caused by design. Gray paint, as much as it is a signifier of gentrification, does not cause gentrification.
Hmm.
Gentrification is caused, it's financial incentives for people who have money and own property and can basically like wield their power over neighborhoods however the hell they want. And they paint the houses gray and add fairy string lights and coffee shops or whatever the hell we want to blame. And so I mean it's important to realize these things. Like it's so important and I think young people are realizing this, what design can and can't solve, or at least what design can and can't solve by itself as a field. It has to be a part of a broader political struggle, whether that be through labor or whether that be through things like, for example, protesting like the border wall. That was an inherently spatial act. And yeah, climate change, Jesus. So yeah, these social movements, like Sunrise Movement, for example, speaking of climate change, is a remarkably young movement driven almost entirely by young people. I mean, young people. And like, or like the DSA, or like, Bernie Sanders, like any of these kinds of like, these movements that are of like a certain like political tendency, which is like, left liberal or leftist.
Yeah.
And they build power, and they, and so it's like, these are, and I mention these because they are very much driven by young people, in a way that, like, for example, the Democratic Party is not. Like Joe Biden is how old again? I mean, Bernie doesn't count, but it's like, so yeah, but AOC does. And I mean, these are the political voices that people are talking about. That are gaining like the most notoriety and the most attention, and saying the things that are the most provocative, and have like the offering the solutions that are perhaps like the most cogent for dealing with the problems at hand, at least in America. And it's so funny because, like, globally speaking, like if you were to put like AOC in like, France, for example, or Germany, like she would just be like another like, center left political figure there. But because we live in America, like she's considered like the uber socialist or whatever. And but yeah, I mean, these are young movements driven by young people asking big questions, and trying to take big power. And I think that trickles to architecture, and I think it speaks volumes for what the potential for architecture can be. I mean, that's where I personally see hope. I'm speaking personally.
Yeah, well, this is really, I mean, this is a good point to end on, really, because you suggest to our students that they need to empower themselves. And
you do. You have power.
And I think sometimes when they've been up all night or headed for a crit, they feel like they probably have very little power.
Yeah, I mean, and also like I feel like the crit system, the jury system, is unnecessarily brutal. Like I've sat on juries where like I've seen like practitioners basically eviscerate students, and that I find that intensely disgusting. And yeah, that's a whole other thing that yeah, I mean, it is hard when you are working like night and day on these projects, and trying to communicate your ideas as like best as possible. And I mean, it's a really, honestly, like to be an architecture student is like an exercise in like deep hope and resilience that I think isn't lauded enough, because there's so much of the effort, so much of the emphasis is kind of like tongue-in-cheek placed on the suffering. But the act of like being someone who goes to school, who spends all this time and devotes themselves to trying to essentially make the world a better place through means that are some perhaps like different than others. I mean, that I think speaks again to like, that's a very optimistic thing to be in life. And we live in very, very, very pessimistic times. And so, yeah, I guess, yeah, that is a good place to stop, which is like, yeah, empower yourself and have hope. I mean, Jesus, if you don't have hope, the alternative is so dark.
Well, I think that's really important, Kate. And I think that in our school, we have, I think, a pretty constructive sensibility about critique. And I have to say, my students are some of the most optimistic and inspiring people I've met.
I love to hear that.
And I meet them all the time. It's a wonderful place to be day to day, and I can't wait to get back in front of these men and women, hopefully by the fall. And but let me say thanks so much, Kate. This was a really excellent talk, very inspiring, and I think it forces us all to take a deeper look, not only where we are as designers and architects, but where we sit as citizens, and look at the kind of world around us, and think about our place in it with both our discipline and individually.
Awesome. And, well, I'm glad to hear that.
And one of the great things is that you brought up a lot of names that our students should spend some time looking at. The Huxtables and the Orusoff and Goldberger and Kimmelman, and these are not names that I don't think the students are necessarily reading the criticism section of the New York Times weekly. but
Read
these are
Sorkin. Read Sorkin. Sorry.
yeah. Well, Michael Sorkin is my hero too.
My
So
hero. Yeah.
okay. Well, look, thanks a lot, Kate. This
Thank you
has
so
really
much.
been a wonderful, wonderful hour and a half, and we wish you all the best moving forward. I'm going to track you down in the New Republic, which I haven't looked at online in forever, and I hope you'll come back and visit us sometime.
Awesome. Thank you. I will, certainly.
Okay.
All right. Have a good evening.
Thanks again. Stay safe, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Perfect.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.